Something happened the last time someone called you a baby boomer. Maybe it was on the news. Maybe a younger person said it with that particular tone, the one loaded with assumptions. And for a split second, something in you went quiet, not angry, not defensive, just privately, quietly wrong, like being called by the wrong name so many times you stopped correcting people, but you never stopped noticing. That feeling is not nothing. It has followed you for decades, and almost nobody has ever given it the right words. Here is what almost every conversation about your generation gets wrong. Baby boomer is an 18-year category. 18 years. The person born in 1946 turned 18 in 1964, before Vietnam escalated, during a genuine economic expansion in a country that felt like a promise being delivered on schedule. The person born in 1961 turned 18 in 1979. Inflation had been eating into household budgets for years. The job market was contracting. The mood of the country was not optimism, it was exhaustion and a slow suspicion that the official version of things was rarely the true one. Same label, completely different worlds. If you were born between roughly 1954 and 1965, you already know this. Not from studying generational theory, from living it. You know it every time someone references Woodstock as if you were there, when the truth is, Woodstock happened when you were somewhere between 6 and 11 years old. What you remember from that period is not the music or the idealism. It is the way the news made the adults in your house go quiet, in ways that children notice without understanding. You were not at Woodstock. You were watching something from a particular distance, old enough to feel the energy of it, too young to be anywhere near it, like a younger sibling watching older siblings do something exciting from the other side of a window, close enough to see the shapes, too far to feel the warmth. Sociologist Jonathan Pontel named this cohort Generation Jones in the late 1990s from the slang term jonesing, meaning a deep craving for something just out of reach. The name fit precisely. This group arrived at every significant opportunity, just slightly too late. The counterculture, too young. The strong job market of the late 1960s, too young. The affordable housing, the pension systems. By the time this generation arrived, the best of it had been claimed by people born just a few years earlier, and the conditions had begun to turn. Always one step behind. Always jonesing for the stability and belonging that seemed available to everyone except the people standing exactly in the middle. To understand what this did psychologically, you have to go back to the childhood that built it. If you were born between 1954 and 1965, your childhood happened in the 1960s and early 1970s, not the celebrated 1960s, not the counterculture or the summer of love, or the version that became mythology. The other 1960s experienced by a child too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to absorb the atmosphere, the tension in adult voices, the images on the television, the way certain conversations stopped when children walked into the room. You were a child during the Kennedy assassination. Some in this cohort remember it directly. Others absorbed it through parents who were visibly shaken in ways children register without having words for. Either way, something was installed that day, an awareness that the world could change without warning, that stability was more fragile than the surface had suggested. You were a child during Vietnam, not the protesting version, not the idealistic resistance, but the dinner table version, the body count on the evening news every night. Too young to understand the politics, old enough to feel the weight of what you were seeing. And then came the 1970s. For this cohort, the 1970s were not a cultural hangover. They were the primary landscape of adolescence. Everything that had been quietly cracking in the previous decade broke open completely. The economy contracted. Inflation became a physical fact of daily life, not an abstract number, but something families felt when the money ran out before the month did. Watergate confirmed what Vietnam had already suggested. Official narratives were not reliable. Leaders lied. The president resigned in disgrace. If you were between 10 and 18 when that happened, it did not update beliefs you had already formed. It formed them. The skepticism was not a conclusion you reached. It was the ground beneath your feet before you knew you were standing on anything. The divorce rate doubled during the 1970s. Many in this cohort watched their parents' marriages end, not as a statistic but as a personal experience. The family structure that had been the background of early childhood became unstable during the very years when psychological development was most active. You adapted. You figured out the new arrangements. You became competent, earlier than you should have, at managing situations adults were barely managing themselves. And somewhere in those years, the house started being empty when you came home from school. This experience gets attributed to Generation X in most cultural conversations. But it began with this cohort, and it shaped them more profoundly because it arrived as a transition, not a given. Many had early childhoods that matched the post-war ideal: a mother at home, a neighborhood full of kids, afternoons with structure and presence. Then something changed. The economy shifted. The divorce rate shifted. The assumptions about women's roles shifted. And the house that had been full started being empty. That shift happened during the specific years when who you were becoming was still being decided. You let yourself in. You made your own snack. You handled whatever the afternoon required. Nobody called to check. Nobody asked what happened at school. And you learnt, not as a philosophy, but as a daily lived fact, that the reliable resource was yourself. Psychologists describe this as autonomous development, and the outcomes are documented. Children who navigate genuine independence develop stronger problem-solving capacity, higher tolerance for ambiguity, a more robust sense of personal agency. These are real strengths, but they do not come free. Because the same experience that built the self-reliance also built something else, a specific relationship with needing people. The child who comes home to an empty house learns not just that they can handle things alone, they learn that handling things alone is the correct default, that waiting for help is less reliable than not needing it, that the appropriate response to adults not being there is to stop expecting them rather than keep being disappointed. Needs. This is the pattern that shows up consistently when researchers look closely at this cohort. Deep self-reliance that reads as strength from the outside, and a specific interior loneliness, the kind that belongs to someone who learned so early to need nothing from anyone that the need itself became inaccessible, even when meeting it would make everything better. Not stubbornness, not pride, something quieter, a habit of self-sufficiency so ingrained it barely registers as a choice. Now consider the economic experience. What happened to this cohort was not bad luck. It was a sequence of circumstances that arrived at precisely the moments when they would do the most lasting damage. This group entered the workforce between roughly 1972 and 1985. Early entrants walked into the 1973 oil crisis and the stagflation that followed. High unemployment, a job market that did not match the education they had been told would open doors. Many took whatever work was available, not from lack of ambition, but because ambition had fewer places to land. Late entrants in the early 1980s faced unemployment near 11% and mortgage rates near 18%. The house their parents had bought for $30,000 now cost 3 times that, and the loan to buy it came at an interest rate that made the monthly payment impossible on an entry-level salary. The life that had been presented to them as the expected outcome of doing things right was simply not available at the price they had been quoted. Here is what makes this specifically a Generation Jones experience. People born just a few years earlier entered the workforce during the cooperative years. They got the good positions. They bought the affordable houses. By the time this cohort arrived, the best of what had been available was already claimed. The people born a few years later faced difficulty too, but without the added weight of a promise being broken. They expected hardship. This cohort expected prosperity and found it gone. Betrayal wounds differently than difficulty. Difficulty produces resilience. Betrayal produces resilience and a permanent skepticism, the capacity to keep working hard alongside an awareness that the reward is not guaranteed, regardless of the effort. Then there is the cultural question, and this may be the experience members of this cohort recognize most immediately in daily life. When someone says baby boomer, a specific image forms: Woodstock, the counterculture, social revolution, the confident collective belief that the world could be changed through idealism. This describes something real about people born in the late 1940s and early 1950s who came of age during that moment. It describes nothing about someone who was 8 years old when Woodstock happened. When someone says Generation X, another image forms: grunge, irony, preemptive detachment worn as a kind of armor. This also describes something real. But by the time that aesthetic was being assembled, many in this cohort were already working, already building families, already past the years when that sensibility takes root. What you actually grew up with was the Brady Bunch and Saturday morning cartoons, and Star Wars arriving in 1977 and changing everything about what a movie could feel like. You remember standing in line for that film, the specific electricity of it, something you had never felt at a theater before. You remember disco and the first video games, and the Iranian hostage crisis on the news every night for over a year, not as history, but as the background hum of your actual adolescence. These are your real touchstones. But the broader conversation talks about events you were too young for, or describes the generation after you, a worldview you had already outgrown before it fully formed. You are lodged between two stories, both written about someone else. You notice it at family dinners when someone makes a boomer joke and something in you says quietly, "That is not me," but you let it pass because explaining would take longer than anyone wants to sit with. You notice it when a younger colleague says something dismissive about your generation, and you feel the familiar pull of wanting to say, "That is not what I lived." But you do not say it, because you have spent a long time not saying it. You notice it when a documentary about your era interviews people a decade older and presents their experience as the definitive account of what that time was like. You notice it in conversations, in news segments, in the specific exhaustion of being consistently described by a label that was never designed to fit you. That silence is a very old habit, the habit of adjusting without complaint, of not expecting the surrounding world to accurately account for your actual experience. You learned to live with a category that did not fit, because waiting for a better one was not a reliable strategy. Psychologists call the worldview this experience produces calibrated realism, the ability to assess situations as they actually are, rather than as optimism or cynicism requires them to be. It protects against manipulation by false promises without preventing genuine engagement with things that work. It came from growing up in this specific historical moment, and it is a genuine strength, not just a wound. This generation has spent decades being described either as privileged or as overlooked, and neither account has been complete enough to be honest. The actual picture is more complicated and more interesting than either version. Then you were born between 1954 and 1965. You are not the boomer the cultural conversation describes. The post-war optimism was your parents' experience. The counterculture belonged to people older than you. What you actually lived was the gap between the promise and what was delivered, and you built something real in that gap, with the tools available, under conditions that were less cooperative than anyone acknowledged. The label never fit. Deep down, you always knew that. Knowing it more clearly now does not change what happened, but it might change the way you carry it. The resilience was not accidental. The self-reliance was not only a wound. The skepticism was not cynicism. It was the appropriate response to available evidence. These things were built by specific people, in specific years, with no guarantee that anyone would ever describe what the building cost. This has been an attempt at that description. Your experience deserved it. It always did. If something in this video felt like recognition, share it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one.